Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
Before we begin, we're going to do more of a closer look at some of the players right now in all of this. The major big time attempts that are going on right now to pin blame on the COVID-19 global the consequences of the outbreak of and consequences of COVID-19 on a global basis on the Chinese government, which is there's a major play going on right now, particularly within a pretty significant and I would say very influential element of the Trump sphere as far as the national security considerations go. And then we're going to get into that with some of the historical elements of this, going back into a couple of topics. Going to be reading from some things, but before we do that, I'd like to mention and recommend a friend of ours who has been doing some great work as of in recent months. I'd like to direct people to the YouTube channel of our friend Jaleel Appleseed. And Jaleel is somebody who is a very creative individual who takes very important information of I would say vital importance and makes very informative but entertaining videos about them. To say that he has a unique way of taking important information and making unique and entertaining videos out of them, I think, is an understatement. So we will provide the link for our friend Jaleel's YouTube channel, as well as some of his other links. He's also on BitChute for some of his channels that might be considered videos that might be a little too hot for YouTube. So we will link to his work in our show links. And so we just wanted to just say, thanks to Jaleel, and just keep up the great work.
Yeah, his videos are like nothing else out there I'm aware of. The combination, he searches and digs up like really crucial documentary footage from all around like the world's media, and like firsthand video of the kind of topics that we like to explore here on the Antidote, and a small network of researchers on the web have for the last years, and then put that in combination with a very interesting and quirky artistic eye and narrative approach, and he keeps my mind moving. And so thank you, Greg, for directing people to his channel.
Of course, and Jaleel, I know you're listening or will be listening. So just let you know that yeah, we appreciate your work and keep it up. And so anyway, moving on into what we're going to talk about today. Last week we got into Whitney Webb's article from April 1st, 12 days ago, regarding the all roads lead back to Dark Winter, and we got into the Dark Winter exercise, which was pre-September 11th, which focused on smallpox and the idea and the concept of using a disease as an element of warfare, basically through biological warfare, by using a major disease as a means to cause global instability, and even blaming it on certain targets or enemies of the U.S. and its allies. The U.S. I guess the U.S. enemies of U.S., Israel, etc. In the lead up to September 11th, we got into some of the players in this drama, including a man by the name of Robert Kadlec, who I think is a very, very somebody who was very much flown under the radar in a huge way, whereas all the talk is on these various figures, whether it be Anthony Fauci or whoever else. Meanwhile, Kadlec is here flying under the shadows. And so we talked about him in our last show, and we're going to follow up on that conversation and getting into we also did get into, and we've done this on a couple of shows, what I mentioned at the top of the show, which was this getting into right now the China hawks, the people pushing the really hawkish rhetoric on China, and how this is in a very large way an extension of the war on terror propaganda channels from the Bush administration, also during the Obama administration, who have now really coalesced around Trump in a very, very significant fashion, but also even going back prior to that with some of the Cold War era propaganda networks. And we're going to talk about people like Frank Gaffney, who go back to that later in our show. But Jeremy, I believe we're going to start out. You have some passages, some excerpts from the book Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas regarding some of the nature of the relationship between Israel and China, which has also flown very much under the radar. And one thing you'll see about these hawks who are all in this Committee for the Present Danger China and other groups who are very much pushing the hawkish rhetoric against China right now do not discuss publicly, at least, and that is the nature of the Israel-China relationship with all these trade deals being made, China taking over Israel's biggest port, the port of Haifa, among other things. And so this history is very important, and we've talked about it before, but we're going to talk about it some more here now. So, Jeremy, I'm going to let you take the floor and read some excerpts from Seeds of Fire here regarding this relationship, and we'll have a conversation back and forth if anything comes up as far as interesting points that should be maybe elaborated on or side noted on.
Okay, that sounds good, because it is the case we want to do two difficult things at the very same time here. One, which is keeping an eye on this newest group. Well, they're not that new, but their newest iteration, the CPD, right? The Committee for the Present Danger, or the Committee on the Present Danger, but maybe they're the Committee for the Present Danger. Maybe it would be more appropriate. That if we go back through their history, we will see that they seem to be at every single moment around these crises that are sort of implemented globally, whether it's something like the Cold War, for example, as we've talked about the relationship with the Cold War to the War on Terror, and they always pop back up in a new format, in a new with new team members. Team B maybe has now become Team C, Team D, and Team F. Let's declare this one Team F. So that's one thing. And so it's obvious that as they point the finger at China in a way that some of these same kind of guys and same exact people, maybe if we're actually talking about like Frank Gaffney Jr. did around the Soviet Union, we might very briefly want to just sort of look at that fact that there were serious questions about the people surrounding the Committee on the Present Danger, such as Frank Gaffney Jr., back during the Cold War, around such questions about who was the ex-committee, who was the larger, higher level groupings of people who facilitated the Jonathan Pollard spy penetration that was not just about Israel, but that was very much related to large geointelligence related to the Soviet Union. And people like Frank Gaffney were people in this network that were being looked at very seriously by U.S. counterintelligence in relationship to them facilitating it. So this is at the very same time that this then CPD was pointing. They were like the hardest finger pointers at the Soviet Union. All right. So this means a few things. It means that these people should be looked at most intensely in terms of what their actual allegiance is, what their agenda is. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean that if they're pointing the finger at somebody, that person or that nation are not some serious questions to be asked about that. In this case, China. But at the same time, it means we then need to sort of delve a little bit deeper behind the way that this level of finger pointers are doing it. So that's one thing we want to do. We want to delve into this question of the background of some aspects of China and Chinese intelligence history that might be highly relevant, specifically in relationship to things like biological contagions, bioweapons, and then very obviously, and this will connect the two things, is surveillance. Because then the other thing that we really want to do is then again keep our eye focused on where should the tail be pinned in terms of this donkey of this global pandemic, or the global plandemic as people are calling it, declared on 3/11 of 2020. With all kinds of things that don't make sense in relationship to the way that it's being handled, if it were actually being handled by rational actors of good faith, public servant types. So there's obviously both a usage, an abuse of the situation, but at the same time, we need to also continue to dive into who might be behind it if it is fully manufactured, okay? And that needs to be fully on the table, and that includes not only journalists and analysts, but that includes people from the inside, people, whistleblowers of sorts. And, and there's certain examples that are now beginning to pop out, even just like recently this is not near the root of who did it and why, but the response to it, this Navy admiral who was targeted for removal because he was apparently trying to just protect his crew. Remember, this was a nuclear aircraft carrier, I believe. And it looks like, and I'll include some Twitter threads about this from people who would know the background here in terms of what it takes to run the reactor team. And it looks like that's where the COVID-19 outbreak was very intensely focused on that aircraft carrier, was in the nuclear reactor team. Highly specialized, highly crucial in terms of not having, everything go really, really bad. And so he was then, of course, called out and then was walked off the ship to the dismay of those who he had been commanding. Okay, so it's that kind of example, I would say, that we need more of. We need deeper examples of that kind of actual courage by people, especially who are of an oath-sworn background. Okay, so let's get back into the history here. Because as you mentioned, Greg, what these CPD folks, what these Committee for the Present Danger, this committee for sowing the present fear-based, global control propaganda systems, maybe that would be their name. What they will not tell you about in relationship to China is this really deep relationship with a very specific aspect of Israel. So let's get into some of that will include some of the background here. Okay. All right, so Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. And this, as we won't have time to get to it, but Whitney Webb's latest article, published both at her website, the unlimitedhangout.com, and also at The Last American Vagabond, is titled A Killer Enterprise, How One of Big Pharma's Most Corrupt Companies Plans to Corner the COVID-19 Cure Market, Emergent Biosolutions, Jerome Hauer. And so there we have this really intense 9/11 nexus, right? So we want to be able to keep our eye on all of these things, and this merger of biotechnology, bioweapons, and surveillance technology is really what we're trying to plumb here. All right, so this is page 468. And as always, it doesn't, just because we're reading from something or we're highlighting links or stories doesn't necessarily mean that we know all of this to be true, or that we're saying that this source is an unabashed source. That, it's very interesting. This book, in the very back of it, or actually Robert Maxwell, Israel Super Spy, also written by Gordon Thomas, and that one by also Martin Dillon. That one is a large source of the Robert Maxwell, Israel Super Spy, is John O'Neill, the ex-FBI agent who that had worked for Kroll, was working for Kroll apparently at the World Trade Center when he was apparently killed on September 11th. Okay, so there is very interesting background sourcing here that should be taken into account also. All right, page 468, Seeds of Fire, China's Voices of Conscience. January 1st, 2001, Beijing, Washington, D.C. By the year 2001, technology had become like drug addiction in China. People couldn't get enough of it. It manifested itself in more being spent on leisure than on food. Technology had created the illusion it offered a cure for every ill, that computers in every classroom would improve education, that genetically engineered crops would eradicate hunger, and genetically engineered humans would eliminate diseases. In an attempt to meet the insatiable demands of China's new consumer society, technology churned out more and more gadgets faster and faster. Only the most incorrigible Luddite or romantic could deny that technology has brought untold benefits to China, as elsewhere. But it is steadily creating a monster roaring out of control and further undermining the understanding of what it was to be a human being in China. Nowhere was this more evident than in the world of surveillance. Already in Beijing and other Chinese cities, the techniques were coming to be well established. Ultrasonic detectors sensitive to noise or motion, electric eyes which activated cameras and silent alarms in, quote, high security areas, unquote. motion detectors, bugging devices, debugging devices. Long before the year 2010, no Chinese street would be without its CCTV. Employees' phones would be routinely monitored, and the monitoring accepted because of cleverly organized campaigns to make people accept this imposition as a condition of employment. Voice analyzers would monitor, by the way, that's of course, it's now what's obviously being floated here less and less from the background into the foreground in the United States of America amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, is things about that will be related to either antibody presence in blood or vaccines tied to someone becoming potential precursors for certain aspects of access to either corporate or public spaces, work and or public access. All right. Back on page 468 of Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas. Quote, voice analyzers would monitor the tension in a job seeker's voice. A company would ask a job applicant to complete the questionnaire and ask him to read the answers over the phone. Oh, by the way, I think that there was a story recently about how Israeli intelligence was using this exact scenario of voice analysis in relationship to COVID-19 over the phone and analysis. All right. Page 469 now of Seeds of Fire. Quote, the responses would be recorded and fed through the analyzer. The machine would judge the level of stress and decide if the prospective employee was suitable to be employed. The questions would probe every area of a person's private life. Reports had begun to reach the West from China, sent by diplomats and foreign intelligence agents based in the country. They all basically told the same story. Chinese neurosurgeons working at a research center on the outskirts of Beijing were exploring the feasibility of attaching clip-on microchips to the human brain. Supposedly, the chips would serve different and beneficial purposes, one to stimulate a fading memory, another to enhance processing skills, another to improve musical abilities, yet another to improve a person's sporting prowess. Eventually, it was predicted that people fitted with the chips would, for instance, not need to watch a film. With the relevant memory chip, they would instantly, quote, have seen, unquote, the movie.
This kind of information, by the way, it makes you, when you look at this, it makes it demonstrates there is some credence to this idea people have that, like, China, if there is some type of like technocratic that China could be from like a technocratic perspective that you hear so much talked about in terms of the alternative conspiracy oriented media, that you see that in some ways China is like a dream model for that in some ways. So just throwing that in there, hearing all this.
Very much so, and it's very much related also in terms of the good cop bad cop dynamic that we've deciphered a bit in relationship to the 9/11 wars in the Middle East and Syria, clean break wars, Russia and the U.S., and similar in terms of the relationship of the U.S. and China, where the U.S. is, properly seen in many cases around the world as this sort of military juggernaut who enforces its economic power via the implied or actuated use of military force and occupation at times, and leaving a wake of destroyed infrastructure, for example, in Iraq, most obviously, right? But then China is then seen as the one who, yes, there's a sense of a sort of imperial aspect, but it's done in the wake of it leaves you infrastructure and bridges rather than destruction. And so, in many ways, in terms of what's called the neoliberal global order or the globalist economics, that China is in some ways seen as the good cop of all of that. But meanwhile, it's a global police state system. So I agree with you in terms of like that it in many ways the current model of China where it exports infrastructure, but at the price of potential debt, that it does look like an economic imperialism, and domestically in China, in terms of the use of the technology and surveillance control technology, it looks like the wet dream of everything that is said to be the globalist New World Order. All right. Back to the text 469 of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Okay. The quote, the reports were received with understandable astonishment. Human brains are complex biological organisms. Simulations or attempted copies of the section of the action of the brain are usually done with electronic circuitry. The problem was that no matter how good the simulations, the created brain will behave differently from its human version. To place clip-on microchips to human brains was a major step forward, but the Chinese seemed to be advanced in overcoming the many hurdles. The, quote, clip-ons, unquote, could also be fitted with a microchip that could one day read a person's mind and report what it was thinking to a computer. To those in the CIA who still dimly remembered the infamous MK-Ultra quote-unquote mind control experiments the agency funded in the 50s, the reports were a reminder of what might have been if Congress had not intervened to stop the research. Okay, an aside here, this is also where this book is obviously a limited hangout, and it because it's also related to September 11th, where it sort of it holds the whole Bin Laden did it at some level, but there was some kind of Chinese involvement with Bin Laden, right? And so in this case, it's like, just the blatant aspect of, brain, the CIA stopped brain mind control research in the 50s because Congress shut it down is of course absurd. And so that it does show the weaknesses or the limited hangout aspect of where this book is coming from. At the same time, there's stuff here that is almost nowhere else that I can find in printed material. Okay. All right, back to the text. Quote, just like the Chinese, the CIA had used human guinea pigs, patients at the Allen Memorial Hospital in Montreal, for its purposes. None of the Canadian patients had given permission to be subjected to a battery of inhuman experiments. Almost certainly the patients in China would not have given their consent to having themselves experimented on for what would be the ultimate surveillance system, a microchip attached to a human brain which would read its very thought and report it to others. In other areas, too, China had been dramatically upgrading its surveillance techniques and spying. While the Bush administration had already indicated it would not object to increased cooperation with the Beijing leadership, China had shown itself as a potential threat to America's military planners. That threat included a number of new surveillance systems. One was China's so-called quote-unquote fast ship, able to travel at 120 miles per hour and equipped with a whole new range of surveillance equipment with the original Enhanced Promise software. China had developed new radar capable of detecting America's most advanced stealth jet fighters. Instead of emitting electromagnetic energy pulses, which bounced off an enemy aircraft and betrayed its shape and size, the Chinese system depended on analyzing fluctuations in commercial television and radio signals filling the air. Even the stealth fighter, whose bat-like shape is designed to fool conventional radar by reducing its own radar quote-unquote signature to that of a large bird, could not avoid causing fluctuations to radio and television signals. The fluctuations could also be adapted for surveillance purposes. Long inured with its mistrust of foreigners, the Chinese were already spending billions of dollars updating their surveillance systems to track those who visit their country. Privacy International, a London-based human rights group, claims that from 2001 onwards, visitors to China will end up on anywhere up to 300 interlinked databases. Within this system, every foreigner becomes caught in a surveillance web enveloping everything they do and spend, what they order from hotel room service, what emails they send via their laptops, when and how they change their money into Chinese currency, who they talk to and dine with, what kind of transport they use. It is all recorded on one of those databases. Like much else it was creating, China was determined to be a leader of a surveillance society through information technology to police the morals, thoughts, and behavior of all of its citizens. Already, hundreds of thousands of cameras have been placed on buses, trains, and elevators. Many Chinese expect to be routinely filmed from the moment they leave home. Hidden cameras are installed in cinemas, alongside roads, in bars, dressing rooms, and housing estates. Once viewed as a blunt tool of surveillance, such devices in the space of 15 years have become a benign, integral part of the urban Chinese infrastructure. It is the integration of surveillance with their day-to-day environment that is most telling. Visual surveillance has also become a fixed component in the Chinese design of modern urban centers, new housing areas, public buildings, and even throughout the road system. Soon people's spy technology will be engineered into all forms of architecture and design. It is perhaps only a matter of time before the regime installs the cameras into all homes. Surveillance has become a design component in all Chinese information technology. Systems architects are required to design technology that will capture, analyze, and present personal information. Accordingly, the workplace is fast becoming a surveillance zone. Electronic supervisors analyze every minute of the working day, checking on performance rates, toilet breaks, and personal activities. Chinese citizens are routinely entrapped into handing over their data. Dozens of laws force them to disclose personal information that is then used for unrelated purposes. Government surveillance has infiltrated every element of communications networks. Telecommunications companies are required by law to ensure that their equipment is quote-unquote wiretap friendly. I mean, and aside here, sounds very similar to the United States of America, but again, similar to the sort of good cop, bad cop, depending on what side of a specific issue we're talking about. That the sort of the Communist Chinese party, the Chinese Communist Party, is seen as running a basically a communist state capitalist enterprise where they have tons of control over infrastructure and technology building. There's this approach that's sort of seen as the government approach to the surveillance systems and information surveillance systems, and then in the United States and in the West, or most specifically in the United States, we've had this sort of corporatist capitalist approach to the opt-in, basically, where it's a consumer product where you are enticed because of the lure of free or cheap information technology services to then opt in and give over your data. And we've talked about the Total Information Awareness Project in the wake of September 11th, how that the icon of that was going to be the pyramid with the all-seeing eye at the top, and John Poindexter, I believe, was who was involved in that. And then it was seen as a little bit too forward for the government to be directly involved in doing that. And then a few years later, the backing, the DARPA-backed, the Silicon Valley DARPA, In-Q-Tel-backed company, Facebook, really, was then implemented as a sort of an opt-in for the social network information surveillance technology for the people of the United States, and then now billions around the world. Okay, so I'm just sort of pointing out that there's these, we're all being sort of funneled in many ways towards these end states, but with a different mechanism. The means is different depending on where we grow up. Okay, Greg.
Yeah, I'm just listening here. Okay. So let's keep going through the book, please, if you're ready to.
Yeah. Here we go. All right, page 4, bottom of page 470, Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas. Quote, the state can do more or less as it pleases with data in the name of law enforcement, public interest, public health, national security, or national revenue. Chinese are obliged through an increasing number of laws and technologies to disclose details. Disclosure of their identity sits at the heart of all Chinese technology, but the nightmare vision of Big Brother is a reality of every entity, citizen, state, and corporation, working in partnership to achieve an alleged quote-unquote common good. Chinese citizens and businesses routinely are advised that they have a responsibility to support the authoritarian measures. At a variety of levels, they are all expected to become partners in surveillance. The last vestiges of trust and privacy, two treasured concepts, have long ago been removed from Chinese minds. No building in Beijing or any other Chinese city, town, or hamlet across the country could operate efficiently without microchips, which constantly feed the great banks of computers by which the government keeps track of its citizens from the moment they were born until death. Ironically, much of this has been possible due to China's theft of U.S.-created technology. The country had survived the economic meltdown that had been predicted for it in the 1980s and 90s. It had, the one for Russia, Soviet Union, right? It had set about establishing itself as the flagship of what would become the Asian century. The new Asian century? Okay. By the year 2005, of the 13 world cities with populations of over 10 million, 7 would be around the Pacific Rim. By then, China's predicted economic growth of 8% per annum would allow its technicians to continue creating a multimedia super corridor to rival Malaysia's Cyber City. China's reserve of foreign currency would, by the year 2010, exceed that of Japan. 1 of every 10 corporations around the Pacific Rim would have Chinese investors, many the largest single stockholders. Singapore would be a Chinese city. The 1/3 Chinese population of Malaysia would have tightened its control over trade and investment. In the year 2001, that had already accounted for 50%. At the start of the century, the small Chinese populations of Thailand and the Philippines controlled 60% of those nations' economies. By the year 2015, that figure would have increased by a further 20%. Much of China's success came from export of technology, including surveillance systems.
This is like,
yeah.
What I was going to say is this all you're describing here with this rise of what was called the Asian century and this concentration of population, and with that population comes concentrations of power right here in this particular area of the world. I mean, this is like a perfect recipe, a perfect storm for the rise of what was first, I think, was first kind of played out to an extent through what we know as BRICS, which was the economic union of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But then through looking at this from a geopolitical lens of a shifting of global power out of the traditional Western power centers and into this insurgent Eastern sphere. This is a perfect, I think, this is a perfect environment for the implementation and carrying out of the Belt and Road Initiative from that regard, as far as an economic geopolitical, very vital to from an economic and a geopolitical perspective in terms of a shifting of global power at some level from the West and into the East, i.e. Russia, China, other interested parties. So I wanted to throw that in there. And then also with the mention of surveillance being such an important aspect here in the government involvement in all the surveillance, exactly who and what entities within the Chinese government did Eric Prince strike these deals to bring his services, quote unquote, into the Xinjiang province, which is where all these Uyghur Muslim, it's where the Uyghur Muslim situation is really bad in terms of, at the very least, a strong surveillance state, at the very worst, much more sinister than that in terms of actual, inhumane treatment of the populations and borderline death camp conditions.
Thank you for adding that. Yes, the Eric Prince role here is crucial to understand the global machinations of all of this, and so because he actually ends up being sort of seen as coordinating logistics that is really in many ways sort of like the military contractor for the cyber logistics and the infrastructure and industrial logistics of the Belt Road Initiative. So I think that's a key question you've brought up about what are these networks that he was exactly working with. So I'm going to go back to this text. I might skip ahead in a little
Yeah.
bit here to the section. I want to be sure to get the section about the relationship of China and Israel in terms of bioweapons. But there's so much here about historical background that is really crucial, I think, to understand this moment.
Yeah, and I would throw in just real quick, in addition to that, is Eric Prince's close proximity relationship-wise with a lot of allies of his in this, right in the mix of this committee on the present danger China, if not ideological, if not outright allies, such as his relationship with Steve Bannon being regular on Breitbart Radio, the Mercer Empire, and the lead up to the election, but also indirect through ideological allegiances. So.
And Bannon, of course, is on the current council on the present danger board. And I would also point out that what's not often remembered is this, that the DeVos connection to the health systems company that seemed to have been involved in potential Trump Alpha Bank server covert protocols going on during the 2016 election campaign, and that this question of health information is really, really crucial right now in relationship to health martial law or biological surveillance, and remembering back to the show that we did about the story by Johnny Vedmore, dealing with Nicole Junkerman, this key, apparently Israeli operative who was teamed up intensely with Epstein, was with Epstein in the UK, and most currently has been involved in attempting to apparently try to outsource the UK health system data of all of its people to a contractor that looks to be tied to the heart of Israeli military intelligence, right? So we want to continue to keep an eye on that aspect of this moment of health data and how crucial all of that is going to be. Ivanka Trump floating the idea of a HARPA, basically a health version of DARPA, and especially now, bam, with the sort of 3/11 global pandemic going on now, that is now going to be amped up, and it's going to be justified to keep an eye, to be able to, for us to keep ourselves safe, and for the government to keep us safe in relationship to tracking us and merging the question of the already existing big data corporatists, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitter, the information that they have with the healthcare system, both the privatized healthcare system and the government healthcare system, and turning it into one surveillance architecture. So I just wanted to point that out. All right.
Thank you.
Moving forward here, page 471 of Seeds of Fire, and I'll just read a little bit more and then probably jump ahead. Quote, even nations in Africa and Asia still impoverished at the start of the new millennium would, 30 years later, possess its gadgets and built-in robotic brains to understand the likes and dislikes of those they served. These machines, with their artificial intelligence skills, would be the modern-day equivalent of the trusted human servants of the early 20th century. But unlike those butlers and parlor maids who only gossip to each other about their employers, by 2020 the robots who came in so many differing forms, shapes, and sizes would be capable of analyzing and assessing and reporting on everything which happened in their environment. They combine their roles of Jeeves and master spies with effortless ease. In China itself, unnoticed and usually unchallenged, surveillance continued to make new inroads into privacy, establish beachheads in Chinese homes and workplaces, and change forever life as people once knew it. Such monitoring has become routine. Chinese visitors were among those at a conference hosted by Codex Data in New York in December 1999. Their hosts had promised they would, quote, learn how to trace email, crack passwords, monitor computers remotely, track online activity, find and recover hidden and deleted data, create trackable files, and locate stolen computers, unquote. They were told that surveillance is increasingly an important intelligence gathering tool. Quote, it is no more than an extension of opening mail, electronic eavesdropping, and planting bugs. The difference is that once the province of the security services. Now all sorts of companies and corporations are doing it. We are moving into a world of those who are under surveillance and those who do the surveillance, unquote. Technologies mostly developed or introduced in the past 25 years have made possible to already extend surveillance so that hundreds of millions of Chinese who have never been subject to it before are now closely monitored. The results of such surveillance can reshape, reform, or at least control the thinking and behavior of any individual. In China, such surveillance is liberated from any legal or moral obligations or restraints. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead here, but it refers to the question of that Robert Maxwell's selling of the enhanced promise software to Beijing, just as quote, just as all those years ago, Rafi Eitan had arranged to have deconstructed the version of the software which had come into his hands after he had posed as quote unquote Dr. Orr, so the Chinese had taken apart, then rebuilt the version Maxwell had sold them. Over the years, many improved versions had been constructed until by the year 2000, China was ready to use it for its greatest ever coup against the United States. It would become known as the most significant software theft in history. The theft was prepared in an annex at the rear of the Ministry of Defense headquarters in Beijing's Dongcheng district. The annex houses the Science and Technology Department. In 1998, when the plan to electronically rob Los Alamos was first mooted, it was under the control of Wang Tonggai, who he had a staff of less than 100 persons. Many were experts in the difficult art of undetected computer hacking. Some of them had learned their skills while working for various companies in California's Silicon Valley. One by one, they had been recalled to Beijing to take up their specialist work inside the annex. Undoubtedly, it would have taken even longer but for the help Mossad technicians provided. They were part of a still secret relationship, one totally unsuspected by the CIA or its fellow members of the Washington intelligence community, that had developed between Mossad and China's Secret Intelligence Service, CSIS. This relationship between the two countries had started in the aftermath of the Persian Gulf War. China had provided Israel with valuable information about the various types of Iraqi weapons systems that had survived the Allied attacks on Iraq, and which could still be a threat to Israel. Israel's own relationship with the American-led coalition during the war had been an abrasive one, not least because Iraqi Scud missiles had hit Tel Aviv, and Israel had been, in the later words of then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, quote, bloody coerced by that bastard Bush, President George Herbert Bush, it's referring to, into not retaliating, unquote. Shamir had welcomed China's initial overtures. As simply as that, the relationship between the two nations had begun. Over the an aside, of course, that's not true, and that you go back a couple more decades, or at least one decade, and you're already dealing with the question of Israeli military intelligence already in relationship with China via Israeli, aircraft industries. Do you remember the guy's name?
Are you referring to Shaul Eisenberg?
Shaul Eisenberg.
Shaul Eisenberg.
Yes. And so he's the key figure, too, if you want to understand the sort of the deeper history of Israeli intelligence in Asia.
And, of course, also prior to this was the Pollard scandal, where a lot of this information, appears transferred from the U.S. to Israel to China with the very Soviet-centric element to it as well. So, I mean, China was key in the whole Pollard scandal as well, prior to what is being talked about here with the Shamir-Bush relationship.
So just filling in those back pieces, I'll finish this paragraph and then skip over the part about where they operationalize the break-in, the Chinese and Israeli combo break-in of Los Alamos around nuclear secrets, because we've already dealt with that a little bit in a past antidote, and then I'll skip forward to the biological section that we have not really dealt with before, I think. Okay, so the on page 473 of Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas, quote, over the ensuing years, that cooperation had developed on all levels. China had provided Israel with experts on water desalination and agricultural techniques. Israel had provided the Chinese with the details of various weapon systems provided by the United States. But it was in the secret world of intelligence, the one inhabited by Mossad and CSIS, that the closest ties had been developed. These had culminated in 1999 when Ephraim Halevi, then Director General of Mossad, and an aside here, remember this is also one of the long-term closest relationships of the CIA's counterintelligence director and the Israel desk, James Jesus Angleton, who in many ways oversaw the penetration of the U.S. Intelligence under the guise of being a sort of super hawk on Soviet intelligence penetration. And yet he somehow just created the perfect situation for Israel to become the back door in many ways for the Soviets.
And Halevi was the director of Mossad on September 11th, and he ended up going to work as of 2018 for Black Cube. So
thank you for pointing that out. Very crucial. Okay. Quote, these had culminated in 1999 when Ephraim Halevi, then Director General of Mossad, had made a secret visit to CSIS headquarters in Beijing. Shortly afterwards, senior members of CSIS had visited Mossad in Tel Aviv. This relationship between the two services would prove to be crucial in what was to follow. The entire break-in to Los Alamos was coordinated by Wu Jingtang, whose official title was a director of ILD, China's Internal Liaison Department. He was one of China's best spy masters. So I'm going to skip over this part about the May of 2000, where they break into the Los Alamos X Division, and only just remind people, of course, keep the eye on the Epstein network. Again, in both of these cases, as I pointed out before, with the Epstein-Nicole Junkerman relationship to UK data technology, of course, Carbine 911, Epstein involved in, Michael Chertoff involved in, Ehud Barak, Victor Vexelberg, Elliot Tawil, the Trump backer. Okay, so this is all about data, the intersection of data and health and security in many ways, right? So I just wanted to keep an eye on that because, of course, the question of New Mexico and the Epstein network and the Los Alamos location and Governor Bill Richardson and Epstein's Zorro Ranch, I think, is crucial in all of this, and that it wasn't just New York or Florida or the island or the airplane. It was also at the heart of the U.S. national security nuclear weapons complex in New Mexico. Now I'm going to skip ahead. Okay, page 478. They're talking about a Chinese what's it called, someone who turned themselves over,
defector,
a Chinese defector, Zhu. Okay, page 478. Zhu chose to open his debriefing with news which brought a wry smile to the lips of his listeners. He told them that Israeli scientists trained at the PLA's, People Liberation Army's, super-secret intelligence and security command in the Western Hills outside Beijing had been trained to perfect the technique of morphing, among others, the images of Yasser Arafat and Saddam Hussein onto television screens. Using specially doctored voice tapes of the actual Arafat and Saddam speaking, these have been re-spliced and perfectly lip-synced so that either leader appears to be making totally outlandish statements against their own people, which could lead to them being toppled. Zhu had witnessed these closed-circuit test transmissions later carried out deep inside the Kiryat Israeli Defense Forces headquarters in Tel Aviv. The transmissions could be relayed to both PLO and Iraqi television stations. They would then replace real-time programs and cause panic, anger, and havoc. The CIA debriefing team knew this development was an extension of what had been done by the United States 193rd Operations Group during the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Then a specially converted 737 flew over Iraq and broadcasted reports directly into Baghdad radio stations urging Iraqi soldiers to desert before the next bombing. Zhu's debriefers had been more interested to learn that other Israeli scientists had returned from China with the capability to arm Shin Bet agents with radioactive aerosol sprays that their Chinese counterparts had shown them how to create. These had been used in the Second Intifada still raging in Israel. The debriefers were shocked to hear Zhu admit that the sprays contained scandium-64, an element whose side effects include creating impotency in a male and severely damaging the fallopian tubes of a woman. He said that when PLO dissidents were arrested and taken to an Israeli police station or detention center, they were strip-searched. Their clothes were then given a small squirt from an aerosol that contained the radioactive chemical. The chemical was invisible, odorless, and left no detectable residue on the clothes. It also quickly penetrated skin. A small squirt of the substance enabled Israeli agents and Defense Force quote-unquote snatch squads to detect a person previously arrested. Zhu explained that this was done by Israeli detector vans equipped with ultra-sophisticated Geiger counters that pinpointed a person previously sprayed. The vans were identical to those already used by Israeli Defense Force patrols. The Chinese-trained Israeli scientists had set up a lab to make aerosol and detector equipment at Israel's top-secret Institute for Biological Research situated in the Tel Aviv suburb of Ness Ziona. Most of its 12 acres of laboratories were underground and protected by state-of-the-art security systems. Within its laboratories and workshops are manufactured a wide range of chemical and biological weapons. The Institute's chemists, some of whom once worked for the Soviet KGB or East German Stasi intelligence services, had a current research program which included developing a range of pathogens which would be, according to a secret CIA report, quote-unquote ethnic specific. The CIA report claims that the Institute scientists were, quote, trying to exploit medical advances by identifying distinctive genes carried by some Arabs to create a genetically modified bacterium or virus.
This makes you think about the obsession that Jeffrey Epstein had with when you're talking about an Epstein scenario to this, the obsession Epstein had with genetics. And, so anyway,
exactly. Quote, a genetically modified bacterium or virus. Still at the early stages, the intention is to exploit the way viruses and certain bacteria can alter the DNA inside their host's living cells, unquote. This research mimics work conducted by South African scientists during the apartheid era to create a, quote, pigmentation weapon that would target only black people, unquote. The research was abandoned when Nelson Mandela came to power, but at least 2 of the scientists who worked in the program in South Africa later moved to Israel. The idea of the Jewish state conducting such research has triggered alarm bells, not least because of the disturbing parallel with genetic experiments conducted by the Nazis. Didi Zucker, a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is on record as saying, quote, "We cannot be allowed to create such weapons," unquote. It was the raw materials for such weapons that an El Al jet was carrying on that October night in 1992 in its 114 tons of cargo that also included Sidewinder missiles and electronics were 12 barrels of DMMP, a component of sarin gas. The chemicals had been bought from Solcatronic, the New Jersey-based chemical manufacturer. The company has steadfastly insisted it had been told by Israel the chemicals were, quote, to be used for testing gas masks, unquote. All right, so then it talks about Dimona and this lab at Ness Ziona and genetic biochemists and genetic scientists working with bottled agents of death, quote, toxins that can create crippling food poisoning and lead to death. The even more virulent Venezuelan equine encephalomyelitis, myelitis, and anthrax. Blister agents, Victor Ostrovsky, quote, claimed that, quote, we all knew that a prisoner brought to the Institute would never get out alive. PLO infiltrators were used as guinea pigs. They could make sure the weapons the scientists were developing worked properly and make them even more efficient, unquote. Israel has so far issued no denial of these allegations. Zhu had confirmed all this and much more to his silent and undoubtedly shocked listeners to this in the CIA safe house. What he had described was far more disturbing than anything they had previously learned, which itself was a precious little about the laboratories at the Institute. Suddenly, Washington must have seemed a long way from the sinister work going on in Israel. Okay, an aside, probably this is also, an aspect of the cover-up here in terms of well, at the very least, post-September 11th, the biodefense, quote unquote, which is also goes hand in hand with bioweapons, was massively escalated in the United States. So who knows what the case was at that point. All right, Greg, we have 5 more minutes left at the most here. Do you want me to just sort of end it there for now, and we can return to the deeper aspects of this question of Israel's biological chemical weapons program relationship to the Chinese, and all of that another time? And you want to just sort of take us out on discussing the CPD a little bit?
Yeah, let's do that. And so, in our last 5 or so minutes here, and we will be revisiting all of these topics. I mean, we still have an in-depth, kind of more deeper dive, I think, into this whole Committee for Present Danger China, bigger network going back
3
to
minutes.
Bush.
3 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry, Greg. Yeah.
Going back to the Bush war on terror propaganda days, and also even before that to the Cold War era. But couple things. If you look at the list of the membership list of the Committee for Present Danger China, the board, I think, is very revealing for a few of the members of it, in particular, that being Steve Bannon, who we mentioned earlier, Frank Gaffney, who's very crucial to this Cold War nest when it comes to the network around people like Richard Pearl and Stephen Bryan and whatever their bigger goal was in the the Reagan administration. And then also you have in there William Bennett, and then General Jerry Boykin, notorious Jerry Boykin. There's a big between those people, a major Council for National Policy foothold into the Committee for Present Danger China. And then also Bill Gertz of the Washington Times being a primary reporter, mouthpiece, as the Washington Times is basically the media print propaganda mouthpiece for the Council for National Policy. And then the final thing I will link to is an article that I think is very, very much worth reading from August 15th, 2002, published in The Nation magazine. This is within a year of September 11th. The men from JINSA and CSP, they want not just a U.S. invasion of Iraq, but, quote, total war against Arab regimes. And it goes into people like the aforementioned Frank Gaffney. It really focuses a lot on him. And one thing it mentions in here, and I think this is important in relation to the neocon split we've talked about under Trump and just the hawkishness of the people surrounding Trump, as even compared to Bush to an extent, is how Gaffney even stood to the right of Paul Wolfowitz in terms of his support of Israeli settlement policy, to the point that even people like Wolfowitz were uncomfortable with it. So we're going to be going back into this topic of just the hawkishness of this CPD China crowd related to Trump, and how it shows a whole nother faction of neocons and warhawks we completely took our eyes off the ball on leading up to the 2016 election and after.
Very good. I appreciate that. And that article, we'll link to all of this, that article at The Nation, the men from JINSA and CSP, they wanted not just a U.S. invasion of Iraq, but, quote, total war, unquote, against Arab regimes, is by Jason Vest. And it's interesting that he also wrote an article at The Prospect a year earlier, December 19th, 2001, titled The Dubious Genius of Andrew Marshall. And so I think we will return again to this nexus here, this sort of Rand nexus, this question of this, the real sort of commanding heights of the U.S. National security apparatus, and how it links into this question of previous Soviet Israel and all of that. And so we'll do a whole bunch of links here. And I guess until next week, thank you, Greg, very much. Antidote, we're out.
Thank you.